Hey guys, welcome back to another video from the Man Talks NRL SuperCoach, and in today's video we finally made it, guys. We've got to the round 1 Teamless Tuesday, so let's get into all the team news. We'll start off with the Storm and Rabbitohs. Firstly, I don't think there was too many kind of major surprises with the Storm team, and same with the Rabbitohs as well. With the Storm, George Jennings has got that Vunivalu vacant wing spot, and Raymond Smith will just be filling in for centre while Branko Lee is out. That does actually put a bit of a question mark between Raymond Smith and Jennings potentially. When Branko Lee does come back, does that mean Jennings or Smith will get that wing spot? We just don't quite know yet. So potentially I wouldn't be maybe jumping on either of the two at the moment, just waiting and seeing. What's really notable, I think, with the Storm is the forwards and the bench. So with the bench, they've gone for a 3 forward rotation with Nicho Hynes as kind of like a utility who can kind of play he plays a bit of like 5'8" fullback, and who I expect to just kind of come on, be a bit of an impact player who can potentially play in like the back line. The news of Finucane and Grant's injuries does really bode well for Brandon Smith and Christian Welch. I think Welch especially is going to benefit a lot. I think I would expect him to be getting close to 50 plus minutes a game, and as a result I think he'll be a great value pick to start the season. And Brandon Smith, obviously with Grant going to be out until I think at least round 4. That does mean Smith will likely potentially get good minutes playing at hooker, and even if potentially there is some talk about Tyson Smoothy, who's in the number 21 reserve, potentially being maybe moved into that 17, and he would actually maybe take some minutes off Smith at hooker. I could be wrong there, but even if he is there, I would still expect Smith to maybe move then into the middle, and so I'd still expect good minutes from Brandon Smith to start, and I think he then becomes a really good value proposition either in your second row or maybe in your hooker spot to begin the year. Aside from that, maybe potentially you could go for, say, Nelson Asafa-Solomona. I don't think I'll be going there myself personally, but I think Smith and Welch are the two kind of main beneficiaries of the Storm bench and the injuries that have fallen the way of the Storm to begin the season. So moving on to the Rabbitohs, again, I don't think there's too many surprises in terms of that backline. That's kind of what we all expected, and I think the main surprise for the Rabbitohs was in the forwards. So Jacob Host winning over that edge spot over Koloamatangi, with Jai Arrow named on the bench. Now, I would say potentially just keep an eye on that. We don't actually quite know yet if Arrow will then move. I would expect Jai Arrow to move into the starting lineup once he's back to more full fitness, given that I think he is coming off some kind of a bit of a hampered pre-season. So I think I wouldn't just be going straight with Jacob Host, potentially just keeping an eye out in the next couple of rounds whether Jai Arrow does even move into that starting second row. Potentially that could even happen this week. We'll get the news before the game. And if anyone had Koloamatangi, I think obviously given that he's starting on the bench, I probably wouldn't go with him as an option given that he's priced around 300k. Benji Marshall at number 14 is quite interesting. That number 14 looks like he's going to be lock, utility, impact player. Potentially, I don't know if that means that he might do a spell at hooker, and potentially take some minutes off Damien Cook. It's hard to predict. Damien Cook's been playing 80 minutes consistently for the past 2-3 seasons, so it's hard to say all of a sudden that that's going to reduce. But something to keep an eye on. Potentially you could argue that might sway you off Damien Cook. I don't think it's that big of a factor to drop him altogether, but something to keep an eye out on in the first couple of rounds. How do they actually use Benji Marshall? But otherwise, overall, I think the Storm and Rabbitohs both pretty settled sides, and I think there are definitely some beneficiaries. So next up, we've got the Knights versus the Bulldogs. Again, the Knights, obviously, they're missing quite a few of their kind of main starting 17, without Ponga, Blake Green. And so I think the backline is pretty standard into what we expected, with Tex Roy being the starting fullback. Connor Watson being named at number 13 is obviously great for us, given that we all kind of piled in on him as our potential cheap hooker or cheap 5/8 option. So I think him starting at 13 is great to see, and I think we should all lock him into our sides to begin the season. What is interesting, I think, with the Knights is their bench in particular. They've gone with a 4 forward rotation, and I think that potentially does reduce the appeal of some of their middles like Clemmer, Saifidi, and potentially maybe Frizzell and Barnett as well to an extent. What is notable though is the lack of a backup hooker on that bench, which I think then does make Jaden Brayley a really interesting prospect at hooker. You'd expect then potentially, given that looking at that lineup, he could be playing about 80 minutes a game. Potentially Connor Watson could spell him for a bit of time at hooker as well, but given that there's no kind of Phoenix Crossland named on the bench for the Knights, I think that does bode well for Brayley in terms of his minutes. And so playing 80 minutes, I think he was averaging about 55 points a game. I've touched on him in my hooker video. So I think if you're looking for a kind of mid-priced, mid-300k starting hooker, Brayley I think does become a good option. And the Knights do have a good start to the season, so he could be a good kind of medium-term hold, I think. Moving on to the Bulldogs, again, I don't think there's too many surprises in terms of the backline. I think it's all kind of what we expected. Good to see that Averillo's been named to start at 5'8", given that he had a bit of an injury concern before the start of the season. With the forwards, it's actually quite interesting, with Hetherington and Ogden being named the starting props, with Dylan Napa on the bench and Fatal and Mariner actually on the bench as well. So that was a bit of a surprise, seeing like Corey Waddell in the starting lineup, and Josh Jackson. It was kind of talk that he was going to be the starting number 13, and we can see that that's happened. So I think, yeah, definitely some good options there in the Bulldogs. I think Hetherington will give a nice option that could be a good cash cow prospect for the beginning of the season. Ogden, I would maybe just keep an eye on as well. I think he was also quite cheap, so if you're looking to just kind of put in their third or fourth front row forward spot, don't think it's a bad option. I would just note obviously that they've got Luke Thompson is expected to come back in round 5, and so that then could mean that they've got more forwards coming back into the rotation, which potentially could then reduce the appeal of, say, like Ogden, Hetherington or Waddell. Bradley Dietz as well, I think he's a fill-in kind of number 9 bench option, and I think he's priced 170k, but I think with Hooker I wouldn't just go with the risk there, given that Jeremy Marshall-King I think potentially could come back and take that spot on the bench anyway. So for me, I probably wouldn't go there. I wouldn't really recommend Dietz myself, given that I think it's a very short-term kind of role that he's going to have at the Bulldogs at that number 14 spot. But I think there are definitely some winners there in terms of, say, Averillo being named, Jackson at lock, Hetherington and Ogden both getting the starting gig at prop. So I think there are some good cheaper options at Bulldogs that we can consider. So moving on to the Broncos and the Eels. So I think there's definitely some winners in both of these sides. Starting off with the Broncos, looking at their backline, Tessinu is confirmed to be the starting centre. So that means we can lock him into our centres if you're wanting to go there at 230k he is. So he's a good cheap option who should be a decent cash cow prospect beginning of the season, with Jermaine Sarko at fullback, which I think was what the expectation was. At 346k, he's a bit of a slightly riskier prospect in that he's obviously a little bit more expensive, but he does have the goal kicking, and he did look quite good in the trial as well. So I think he could potentially be a good kind of mid-range centre option. In terms of the forwards, it gets interesting. Obviously, Jordan Ricky being named in the starting second row is really good for us. I think you can basically lock him in. He should be a good cash cow option for us. Turpin being a number 9 is a good sign, and with that bench, which I'll just touch on now, they've gone for a 4-forward bench, and that does look good for actually Jake Turpin, and it potentially could mean he can get 80 minutes. And I think he's priced about 390k, and he's played 80 minutes in the past. I think if you wanted to go there, you definitely could. I don't know if I'd go there myself, given that I think even cheaper than him, you can get guys like Brayley, Hodgson. Obviously, we've got options like Watson, Lamb, Little. So I don't know if I'd be going with Turpin myself, but if you want to go with a bit of a pod route, you could do so for sure. That bench does concern me in terms of how it might affect the minutes of, say, like Lodge, Glenn, Carrick, all the forwards, like TPJ as well. So I think I initially did have Matt Lodge in my kind of initial draft of my team. I'm less hot on him now as well. Obviously, Payne Haas will come back after his 3-game suspension, and then again, that's throwing another forward into the mix who's probably going to command a lot of minutes himself. So I'm less hot on the Broncos forwards overall. I think Ricky is okay to keep, given that he's so cheap. Lodge potentially if you want to go with a more short-term option, but I think because he is maybe potentially a bit more short-term, I'm a little bit off him now as well, given that you're kind of having to book in potentially a trade to get him out. So for me, Lodge, I don't know if I'm going to be going with him now anymore. But yeah, kind of interesting bench rotation. Obviously, Corey Oates is not even named in the 17 as well. Obviously, you're going to have to put a line through him. He's not going to be in the 17 as of now, so I think he's not really going to be in consideration for us anymore. Moving on to the Eels, I think the Eels, again, very settled side. It didn't really see many surprises here. It was already, I think, touted that Opicic was going to be the starting centre over, say, Hayes Dunster, which is a bit of a shame for us, given that Hayes Dunster would have been a great 173k basement dollar cheapy centre option. What is interesting about the Eels, though, I think, is that bench. They've gone for like a 3-forward and utility option. Will Smith kind of being that utility. Papali'i and Kafusi kind of being like middles, but I don't think they'll be playing too many minutes, and Hipgrave being kind of like an edge player. So I think that does actually really boost the appeal of guys like Paulo, Madison, Nathan Brown. I think they're all going to be playing big minutes, and I think there was talk that Unipaula potentially could be playing more minutes this season as well. So I think they're all going to be very safe picks now. I think Madison basically locked into my second row. I don't see him going anywhere, looking at that bench for the Eels as well. And Paulo, I think if you want to go for a bit of a pod option, I think he'll be a great consideration. I'll try hopefully maybe get him in later in the season. I don't know if I'll go with him to begin the season. But yeah, I think Eels otherwise in general a very settled side. The forwards really are interesting now for the Eels. So next up, Warriors and Titans. Again, Warriors, I don't think there's too many surprises in terms of the backline. Good to see that Chanel Harris-Tavita, I think, has come back from his injury. We haven't seen too much of him in the trials, but he's named to start at number 7. And someone I'm really looking at potentially as like a backup halfback option, given that there's not much, there's not many good options in that position. The forwards and the bench, I think, is the real kind of talking point for the Warriors. Bailey Sirinen getting the starting gig over Ben Murdoch-Masila, I think really does kind of reduce the appeal of Murdoch-Masila, and I think he was obviously quite popular. I don't think you can really consider him now, given that he's started on the bench for now at least. Same with Jazz Tavanga. I think there was potentially with Wade Egan, he had that injury in the trials, and there was potential for Tavanga to become the starting number 9. But given that he's on the bench, I don't think he can really be a consideration anymore as well. Same with Leeson Armel. I saw he was quite a bit of a popular front row forward cheapie option. So yeah, overall I think Sirinen getting the starting gig is quite interesting. Tohu Harris at lock is also potentially a good option. I think the thing is that they've got so many good forwards in that side. We just don't quite know how the minutes are going to be spread amongst all of them. So for me, I don't think I'm going to be going with any of them. I think to begin the season, it will be an approach of kind of seeing maybe the first 3 to 6 rounds, kind of how their minutes kind of shape up. And if there's an option that stands out, say like Tohu Harris is getting 70 plus minutes at that lock position, then I think he becomes a good option to consider. But that's the approach that I would kind of maybe recommend with the Warriors forwards. I think Fanua Blake could be a really good pod front row forward option. He's priced about 528k, so you could potentially argue that he's underpriced. Given that forward heavy bench, I think I'm going to wait and see. If I had to look at that Warriors team, I think Fusatua is obviously a good cheapie centre option, and Harris-Tavita is a good backup half option. But aside from that, I think I'm going to be kind of waiting and seeing on the rest of them. So moving on to the Titans, again, I don't think there's too many surprises here. They looked like a pretty settled side, and it was expected that Fafita and Fasul-Malaawi would be in the starting second row, and Tino at lock for the Titans. Jamal Fogarty, I've kind of put as a bit of a winner, I guess, in that I think he's expected to be the goal kicker. And he does actually, I haven't actually talked about him in my halfback video, but he is someone I've actually started to really consider, given that with the goal kicking, it should hopefully boost up his points potential by about 8 to 10. It's kind of averaging in like the low 50s, so I think potentially with the added goal kicking bonus, that could go up, say, 5 to 10, and then he could become a good value option. And the Titans do have a good start to the season, so he's actually also someone I'm thinking about maybe putting into that backup halfback spot. But aside from that, fairly settled side with the Titans. I don't think there's too much to touch on there. In terms of their bench, they've got Peachy, who probably I expect would come on to be a bit of a forward utility, playing at lock, giving Tino a bit of a break. But I would expect Tino to be playing good minutes in that side. Aaron Clark, I'd expect to kind of be playing in maybe like a hooker role, same with Peachy. So I think in terms of the minutes for Sumala-Awi, I think they're pretty safe, given that he's so highly owned. It's a bit scary, I think, to go without him. But I think Tino then becomes a really good consideration looking at that bench for the Titans. Next up, we've got the Roosters and the Sea Eagles. Again, Roosters, not too many surprises here. That backline is exactly kind of how we expected. I guess the real loser out of that backline is Sam Walker, who had obviously a really good performance in the trial, but it was kind of talked about before that Lachlan Lamb was going to be the starting 5'8" for the Roosters this year. In the forwards, I guess the only kind of surprise in the forwards is that Waerea-Hargreaves is named on the bench as opposed to the starting role. So I think that actually does then boost the appeal of, say, someone like Takeaho. Obviously, Waerea-Hargreaves is kind of like, 32 years old now, so he's obviously getting up there in terms of age. So I'd expect his minutes to maybe continually kind of decline, and being named on the bench is potentially an early indicator of that as well. So I think that then bodes well for Takeaho. He averaged about 57 minutes a game last season. I don't expect that to dip, and given the added bonus of the goal kicking, you'd expect at least maybe say 5 to 10 points from goal kicking, and potentially with a small uptick of minutes to maybe 60. I don't know if that might be stretching it. I think he then becomes maybe the standout front row forward gun option. Definitely someone I've had on my side, and Tupanua obviously getting the number 12 spot, it was expected as well. I haven't talked about him in any of my videos, but he is a popular option I've seen, given that he's starting and he's fairly cheap at around that 400k mark. For me, he just doesn't have the kind of base stats. I think he's very reliant on attacking stats and tries, which he's definitely capable of as well. We saw in the trial that he scored a try as well. But I think potentially that does limit his kind of consistency. Crichton, I think, is an absolute lock in my second row as well. Him and Madison are not going anywhere. And in terms of the bench, they've gone for a utility into like Adam Keiran. Obviously, I'd expect someone like Victor Radley and Sam Verrills to be coming back into the side slowly as well. Potentially, that does actually maybe mean less minutes overall for the forwards. I still think that someone like Takeaho is a safe bet. Crichton, I expect to be playing 80 as it is. I feel like, Radley and Verrills coming in would affect, say, more like Isaac Liu and Jake Friend. So I'm not too concerned, I guess, with Takiaho in the forward. And in the backs, obviously, Teddy, he's not going anywhere. Get him into your team. With the Sea Eagles, there are a few surprises here as well. I think Dylan Walker being named at fullback was kind of the main one. And he does actually then become potentially a decent option, given that he's only listed, I think, around the 300k mark in the centres, with fullback dual listing as well. And typically in Supercoach, the fullbacks do score a little bit better than, say, traditional centre playing players, given that they're required to do a bit more work rate and they're a bit more involved in the attack in terms of finishing up, attacking plays. So I think someone like Dylan Walker that actually could be a good pod center option. Obviously, kind of a loser, I think, for the Sea Eagles is Josh Schuster, someone we were all kind of hoping would get into the starting 17. Given that he was 203k, he would have been a perfect kind of cheap 5'8 backup option. Another loser with the Sea Eagles lineup, I think, is Andrew Davey, someone I had talked about before in one of my videos, thinking that he would be a really good kind of mid-range second row option if he played 80 minutes or got good minutes. But given that he's on the bench, I think I've had to kind of put a line through him and take him out of my team as well. With Jas Gazuski, is that how you pronounce it? Him kind of winning that spot in the second row. But overall with Sea Eagles, there's not too much interest for me myself. Obviously, Cherry Evans is going to be a good halfback consideration, but compared to, say, Cleary, I don't think there's really a comparison. I think out of this, obviously Jason Saab has got the wing role, which is good, given that he's a good cheap centre option. Actually don't have him on my team at the moment. I've just gone with the other cheap centres at the moment, given that I think lack of turbo will affect how Saab plays and how many tries he might potentially get. And the Sea Eagles do have a pretty tough start to the year as well. But someone like Dylan Walker could be a good consideration. Lachlan Crokerite, at number 9, I think is probably maybe more of a short-term play, given that Cade Cust, I think, is expected to be back in round 2. But yeah, otherwise not too much. I guess the thing with Dylan Walker as well is that once Turbo comes back, I don't expect Walker to be staying at fullback. He'd probably get moved back into the centres. So I think that's maybe something to consider with Walker, that he's maybe a bit more of a short-term centre option while he's playing at fullback. So moving on, we've got the Panthers and Cowboys. Not too many surprises with the Panthers in terms of their backline. Is basically how we all kind of predicted it. Momirovski, I think, actually could be a decent option. Not someone I've talked about in my center video, but I think with the Panthers, when you're looking at their backline, I think the big names that stand out are obviously going to be like Staines, To'o, Luai, and Cleary. The forwards is where things are interesting, I think, with the Panthers. So Leota gets the starting prop spot that we kind of predicted as well. Kurt Capewell getting the starting second row as well is very interesting. There is a question mark though, I guess, with Liam Martin on the bench. I would expect Liam Martin to spell Capewell at times, even though he is named at the edge, and I think Liam Martin is apparently being predicted to come on in the middle. Isaiah Yeo, I'd expect to be playing 80 minutes a game. Kikau, I don't think would be getting 80, so I expect Liam Martin to take some of his minutes and some of Capewell's minutes as well. And Spencer Leniu, I think obviously he's that kind of cheap front row forward option that most of us would consider to have on our bench. I think given that he's named on the bench, it's not ideal. Obviously, if he was starting, that'd be better. But I think he's fine to maybe just keep on your front row forward bench. Who kind of would be maybe like a slow cash cow. I don't expect him to be making so much money a lot to begin the season, but something that you can just keep there. So that's really cheap. That might just tick over and make us a little bit of coin over a long period of time. But yeah, Capewell is quite interesting given that he is listed at second row and center in Supercoach. I'm not sure if I'm going to go there myself. He potentially could end up being like the Isaiah Yeo of 2020. The same team as well with the Panthers, that second row who's listed in the centers, who becomes a really good consideration. At 420k, he's okay, I think, to have at the beginning of the season. I actually have, at the moment, I've downgraded To'o to Capewell just to kind of free up some money as well. So yeah, I think it's okay to maybe keep him at the start of the season. I will just keep an eye out on how the kind of minutes play out. I think someone who potentially does have that potential to become like that out and out gun second row forward playing in our centers. So next up with the Cowboys, I don't think there's too much relevance here. Obviously the big loser I think here is going to be Val Holmes, given that he's named on the wing. We don't even quite know who's going to be doing the goal kicking between him and Clifford. So I think Val Holmes being named at the wing, I have mentioned before that if he was named at fullback, I think he becomes a really strong consideration. Named on the wing though, I don't think I can go there myself. The hammer at centre is quite interesting. I think potentially that side of the Cowboys is a good team to target in terms of the attacking players. So say for example in this match, the right side of the Panthers would be lining up against the Cowboys left with the hammer. Overall, the Cowboys' edge defense didn't look that great, so you could potentially expect someone like Momirovski and Charlie Staines to have good potential in that round 1 matchup. Something to consider if that lineup does stay in place with the Cowboys, with the hammer at centre. With the forwards, I guess there's not too many talking points there. I think Reece Robson was someone who I saw in quite a few kind of forums being touted as potentially a good option if he got 80 minutes. But with Granville and Cotter on the bench, who both can play hooker, I think that does kind of draw a line through Reece Robson for me as well. Obviously, Josh Maguire and Corey Jensen on the bench will be forwards coming on for like Taumalolo, McLean. Taumalolo, obviously that big question mark is the minutes that he's going to get. So I think for me at the moment, I haven't got him in my side, and I think I won't be going there until I kind of get a good read of his minutes or if he's potentially gone down in price. But aside from that, I don't think there's too many other talking points from the Cowboys. Morgan is someone I've touched on before you could potentially go for as a cheaper halfback / 5'8" option, but I think there are potentially cheaper and more consistent options, say like Watson and Lamb, that you can go for. So yeah, not many other talking points I think out of the Cowboys. So next up we've got the Raiders and the Tigers. So the Raiders backline, I guess the kind of main surprise here is Sebastian Kris being named at centre, while Jared Croker is still coming back from his injury. I wouldn't recommend getting Kris, given that I think he's going to be a really, really short-term option, given that once Croker comes back, I'd expect Kris to drop out of the side immediately. Bailey Simonson obviously getting the spot on the wing is good for us. You know, we can lock him into our sides, cheap 205k centre option. The forwards at the Raiders, I don't think, again, there's too many surprises there in terms of, say, the starters. I think what is interesting is like the bench. Ryan James is obviously a very popular consideration, given that he's about 230k, he's dual listed, he's been named on the bench for the Raiders. He potentially could be a bit of a trap though, given that, you know, I think if the two Coreys hadn't got their suspensions, I think they probably would have been in the side over someone like Ryan James. So I think once they come back, I think that does then impact Ryan James and his long-term potential. Even with that lineup, I don't even know how many minutes he might get with that Raiders side. You know, they're so forward heavy, so it's really hard to see where James is going to get the minutes and whether he's even going to be in the 17 long-term moving forward. Josh Hodgson does become interesting, given that Havili can play at hooker, but I think the talk that I've heard is that when Havili does come on, Hodgson might then move into, say, the lock role. So he could still be getting like 65 to 80 minutes anyway. I guess the one concern is potentially that they may ease him back from his kind of injuries. But I think Hodgson, with that bench, no Tom Starling, I think on the bench really does help the prospect of Hodgson. So he's someone I've started to really consider a little bit more as well, given that I think he's definitely undervalued at what he's priced at an average of about 42, but historically he's averaging, you know, in the 55 to 65 range. So yeah, I think in terms of the winners of the Raiders, I'd say Hodgson, Ryan James potentially, but I think he could be a bit of a trap, and Kris for one round, I think, or for however many rounds he's going to be there while Croker's out, but I don't think that's going to be too many. So the Tigers, really, really interesting kind of teamless Tuesday. I think there's a lot of good SuperCoach cheap options at the Tigers who we want to consider. So Dane Laurie getting that starting fullback role is huge. I think 220k, I think he is. I think you can lock him into your centre cheapies. James Roberts obviously getting that starting gig in the centres, and he'll be playing on Nofaluma's side, which I think will be the preferred attacking side of the Tigers. So I think he could be a good cheap centre option as well. The one thing to note in that backline for the Tigers is that Adam Doueihi is going to be out for the first round of the season, but I'd fully expect that by round 2 he would come back into the side and probably be either maybe 5'8" or fullback, which does potentially raise a question mark over Laurie, but he looks so good in the trial, it'd be hard to say drop him from that fullback spot, so I think he's still okay to put into your starting team. What I think I would expect is that when Doueihi comes back, he'd probably go into 5'8", and then Moses Mbai then goes into, say, the number 14 role. So just looking at the forwards for the Tigers, obviously props with Timeout Offengalwi, kind of what we expected, with Garner, Leilua and Twal as the second row and lock, all kind of expected. Little, number 9, is huge. There's no Jake Simpkin. You know, the talk all preseason was that, you know, Jake Simpkin could be that kind of number 14 hooker, and that Little and Simpkin would kind of split minutes, say 50-30. But no Simpkin on that bench really then does look like Little could be up for, say, almost 80 minutes a game. So what I think could happen with that West Tigers bench, just looking at it, they've got 3 middles with Packer, Oichikamanu and McKaylee. And Tommy Talau as a number 14 utility. Now, Tommy Talau did play on the wing, obviously, last season for the Tigers, but I think he's also got some experience at 5'8". So what I could see happen is, you know, if they did want to give Jacob Little a rest, they could then just move Tommy Talau to 5'8" and then switch up Mbai to hooker. So I think potentially that means that Little isn't maybe a set 80-minute player that we all kind of hoping for. So that does raise a little bit of a question mark, I think, over Little. And with Doueihi coming back in round 2, potentially Moses Mbai then just goes to that number 14 role when Dewey comes back to 5'8", and then he would probably, I would expect, to definitely spell Little for periods of time. So I wouldn't call Little, I don't know if I'd call him a trap, I think it's a bit too far, but I don't think he's going to be that out and out 80-minute hooker who's priced at 250k that we're all hoping for. I think there is an argument to maybe not start with Little. You could go with other options and see how the kind of minutes play out over the first 2 rounds, what the rotation is with the Tigers. Say if you started with someone like Lachlan Lamb and you find that Little plays 80 minutes and he's predicted to go for a massive price increase, you could just say downgrade Lachlan Lamb to Little and, get the cash there. So I think that's potentially a strategy that I'm toying with as well. But yeah, something to keep in back in mind with Little. Yeah, no Simpkin I think is huge. Obviously, we were kind of hoping that he'd get in there because he was a basement dollar cheap hooker. Yeah, Little is definitely someone to keep an eye on. I think that real forward heavy bench with the other 3 does potentially limit the appeal of guys like Twal, who I think I've seen as kind of a potential option that people are considering. Even someone like Offengawi, given that we don't quite know the minutes with those forwards. So yeah, a lot of question marks over the Tigers. I think big winners, obviously Dane Laurie, Little to an extent. We just have to keep an eye on his minutes. And definitely some losers being Jake Simpkins. So finally, we've got the Dragons and the Sharks. Don't think there was too many surprises with the Dragons in terms of that backline. I think Jack Bird being named at centre is kind of expected, with Cody Ramsey and Ravalawa being the starting wing players. The forwards is interesting. I think Josh Kerr getting that edge spot over, say, Jackson Ford, who's not even in the 17 altogether, does definitely rule out Jackson Ford as that kind of mid-range second row forward option. Terrell Fuimeono going to lock is quite interesting. I thought he was more of a kind of second row / centre player, but he's been named in the middle. I think he's about 260k. You could potentially go with him as an option, but we just don't quite know how long that kind of rotation is going to be in place for, and whether he actually has nailed that number 13 spot for himself long term. I think Farmasuli and Alvaro were 2 middles, so I saw kind of a lot of super coaches hoping that they would get the starting gig, given that they were priced in the 200k mark, and they could have been good, cheap forward options. But I think given that they're named on the bench, we kind of have to put a line through them as well. You could potentially argue with McCullough, probably expected to play 80 minutes with McInnes going down with injury. He could potentially be a good option, but he's priced around the 450k mark, and I just think there are so many good, cheaper hooker options that I would just prefer instead of him. So yeah, overall, I don't see too much kind of relevance with the Dragons. So yeah, I think potentially if you're looking for some cheap options, you could go with, say, Fuimeono, but I think overall I kind of would wait and see on the Dragons and how they rotate their forwards. And finally with the Sharks, I think again, big loser that I kind of mentioned in previous videos was Connor Tracy, who potentially in preseason was training at fullback, but he's been named at number 14 as kind of a utility role that I would expect. So I think I wouldn't consider putting him into my halfback 5'8" reserve spots. Matt Moylan obviously getting the number 6 spot means that he's locked in potentially as good cheap 5'8" backup. We have question marks over Moylan in terms of, yes, while I do understand he's got the previous, he's got the pedigree, I think that all was mainly when he was playing at fullback, when fullbacks contribute a bit more to the attacking plays in terms of doing those final balls for try assists, line break assists, etc. The Sharks do have a tough start to the season, and obviously he's got that injury concern, so I don't actually know if I'm going to be getting him in to start the season. In terms of the forwards, I think not too many surprises there. Billy Magoulias at number 17 is potentially an option, but the thing that I would keep in mind with Magoulias is that I think guys like Royce Hunt and Talakai will come back by, say, round 2 or 3, and I expect, looking at that bench, I would expect Magoulias to be the one to drop out. So even though he is named and he is a cheap kind of second row option that you can put into your side, I don't think I wouldn't be recommending to choose him myself. But aside from that, I think overall this Dragon Sharks game doesn't have too much kind of Supercoach relevance for me, at least. Obviously Fafita has dropped out, which I know a lot of players had chosen him based on his recent kind of performances, but I think given that he's completely out of the team, we can't really consider him at all, really. But he, again, would be someone who has a threat to, say, Magoulias as well. But yeah, those are overall my kind of thoughts on the Dragons and Sharks. Not too much there, I think, that's going to really impact us in terms of our Supercoach selections. So, and yeah, probably a game that I will not be watching, I think. Alright guys, we made it through the round 1 team list. Hopefully that was insightful for you guys in terms of looking at the different teams and how they've kind of used their bench and how that potentially affects the minutes and rotation of some of the players named in their teams. I think there are some definite winners that we've kind of highlighted throughout the video. There are going to be some good cash cow options that we can lock into our sides in the centers and in the forwards. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. If you do like the video, please give it a thumbs up and do please consider subscribing, as I'll be putting more videos out throughout the NRL SuperCoach season. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next video.